This is Dr. Momsilovich with your lecture 7.1 on Protostome Animals. Since we're starting our discussion of animals, it's important to discuss what exactly an animal is. Animals are all eukaryotic, multicellular, heterotrophic organisms that obtain their nutrients by digestion. So in past lectures, we've talked about plants, which are photoautotrophic, meaning that they make their own food from the energy of the sun. There's also fungi, which are heterotrophic, but they do digestion on the outside of their body. So they secrete enzymes that break down material and then absorb that broken down material into their bodies. Animals digest their food within their own bodies. Animals are also different because they have epithelial tissues. They also have muscles that are made of actin and myosin, and those muscles are connected to nerve cells, which allow animals to react to their environment as well as move. Most animals reproduce sexually, and then they go through a series of developmental stages. Those stages start with the formation of a zygote. That zygote undergoes cleavage, and cleavage is where you have cell division without any cell growth. They then go into an 8-cell stage. They undergo cleavage again and become a blastula, and then go through gastrulation and become a gastrula. So animals, as we know them today, probably evolved from a colonial protist that lived in Precambrian seas. So protists, some even today, can form colonies where they're in sort of a clump of identical cells. They can also change so that they form a circle around a hollow sphere, and the cells within that sphere have different jobs. Some of them act as somatic or body cells, and some act as reproductive cells. And so what we think happened is that animals evolved from this early congregation of cells that were acting together as one. Before we can talk more about different types of animals, we have to go over some terms that will make this a little bit easier to understand as we move through. Some of this will be a little bit of review from your labs, but we are just going to go over it in a little bit of detail here so that we all are on the same page. So within animals, they have 3 different possible body cavity types. The first is an acoelomate, which means that they don't have a true body cavity. So in an acoelomate, they have a layer of ectoderm, which is a layer of tissue. They have another layer of tissue below that called the mesoderm, and then an inner type of tissue called an endoderm. Within that endoderm, there's a digestive cavity. So there's no actual body cavity within that individual. It's just layers of tissue surrounding a central digestive cavity. On the other hand, eucoelomates have true body cavities. These are things like worms or insects or even humans. Eucoelomates have an outer layer of ectoderm, which would be something like your skin. Beneath that, there's the mesoderm, which is your muscle. And if we're talking about a human being, then within that muscle, you have a coelom, which is your body cavity. And within the coelom, there is more muscle that surrounds the endoderm and your digestive system. And it's important to understand that that mesoderm is muscle that is surrounding your body cavity and is surrounding your digestive cavity and allows you to push food down through it. So a eucoelomate is called a eucoelomate because that means a true coelom, meaning that you have a true body cavity that is space that surrounds your gut. So the central part of your body, your gut or your digestive cavity, is called the lumen, and that lumen is surrounded by endoderm. The third type of body cavity is called a pseudocoelom, and it's called that because the endoderm isn't lined with mesoderm. So pseudocoelomates have an ectoderm followed by a layer of mesoderm, which is muscle, and then followed by a body cavity, or the pseudocoelom. Within that, there's the endoderm, and then their lumen, or digestive system. And they're called pseudocoeloms because that mesoderm layer is outside of the body cavity, or outside of the pseudocoelom, and does not line their gut, and therefore their digestion does not operate in the same way that the digestion in a eucoelomate does, that's assisted by the squeezing of those muscles to help push food through the digestive system. When we're describing animals, we can also describe the number and types of body layers that they have. Animals are either diploblastic or triploblastic. A diploblastic organism only has 2 layers. It has an ectoderm and an endoderm. These are the simplest animals have this type of layer. All of the other types of animals are triploblastic, meaning that they have 3 layers of tissues. They have an ectoderm, a mesoderm, and an endoderm. These layers are important during development because all of the other tissue types are derived from these different layers. So your ectoderm forms your skin and also your nervous system. Your mesoderm forms your muscles, and the endoderm forms the inner lining of your body. You can also describe the type of symmetry that an organism has. The most simple or basic animals have asymmetry, meaning that none of their body cannot be cut in any way that would have it be the same on both sides of that cut. The next type of symmetry to evolve is radial symmetry, meaning that you could cut that organism in half anywhere on its body and the 2 halves will be the same. The third type of symmetry is bilateral symmetry. This is something that humans and dogs and cats and cows and goats and elephants and lions, all of those types of things have, as well as frogs and earthworms and things. They have bilateral symmetry where if you cut the organism down the center of its body, 1 half is the same as the other. So in this lecture, we're going to talk about the invertebrate phyla. Invertebrates are animals that don't have backbones, and they represent 95% of the animals in the animal kingdom. There are different types of animals. There are protostomes and there are deuterostomes. Today we're going to talk about all of the organisms that fall into the protostome category. So we're going to talk about porifera, which are sponges, cnidaria, which are jellyfish, platyhelminthes, which are flatworms, nematodes, which are roundworms, mollusks, which are clams, squids, snails, and octopi, annelids, which are the segmented worms, and arthropods, which are insects, crabs, shrimps, spiders, all those good things. First, we need to discuss what we mean when we say a protostome versus a deuterostome. A protostome is something where the mouth forms first from the blastopore and the anus forms second. So during embryonic development, you're first going to have a mouth form and then the anus comes after. In deuterostomes, you have the opposite, where the anus forms first from the blastopore and the mouth forms later. Deuterostomes include things like chordates, which includes humans. All animals fall under the category of metazoans. Within that, the most simple and basic animals are the sponges, and everything else sort of follows that. We're going to talk about in today's lecture all of the phyla that have a star next to them. This particular phylogenetic tree is a little bit simplified, but we're doing it this way to sort of keep a little bit of control over the things that we're talking about, because there's far more phylum that we could discuss in a semester. So the first phylum we're going to discuss are the porifera, which are the sponges. Sponges are asymmetrical. They have no true tissues. They have a cell level of complexity, and they can be found in both marine and freshwater ecosystems. Sponges are sessile animals, meaning that they are rooted in one spot and are unable to move around. They also lack true tissues, so their bodies are made up of individual cells. Because they're made of cells and they are unable to move, the way that they feed is through coordinating the efforts of the different cell types within their bodies. Sponges have amoebocytes, which look like typical amoebas and move around and get food particles. They also have choanocytes, which beat their tail and create a water current so that water is sucked in through pores on the sides of the sponge and then comes out through the central canal. And by pulling water in through those pores, the sponges are able to bring food particles in, which the amoebocytes then will move around and grab and take in for the sponge. The next group that we're going to discuss are combined into what is called the radiata. This includes the phylum Cnidaria and the phylum Ctenophora. These individuals are radially symmetrical. They are the only animals that are diploblastic, meaning that they have two tissue layers, and they have a simple nerve net, which means essentially is like a hair net that goes around the outside of their body, and it allows them to contract muscles, which allows them to move. They also have only one opening. They don't have a full digestive system, so they have a mouth and no anus. The phylum Cnidaria is characterized by organisms that have radial symmetry, and they also have tentacles with stinging cells on them. There are two basic body plans of a cnidarian. There is a polyp form and a medusa form. They are essentially a sac with a gastrovascular cavity, and the polyp form is sessile and is attached to a surface. The mouth opening faces upward, and the tentacles will move and essentially move water and food into the body cavity where it's digested, and then waste products move out through the same mouth-anus opening. The other form is the medusa form, which is the rotated version of a polyp. Medusas are able to swim in the water, and their mouth and anus opening faces downward. And they also use their tentacles to move water and food particles into their gastrovascular cavity where it's digested, and then waste products move out from that mouth-anus opening. After we leave the radiata, we move into the bilateria. So all of the other organisms in the animal kingdom have bilateral symmetry. Within that, there are three major groups. There are the deuterostomes, the lophotrochozoans, and the ecdysozoans. We're going to talk about the lophotrochozoans first, and then move on from there. This addition to this tree that you have is in a little bit more detail than you need to know, so don't memorize everything in the red box. But it's just, there is a lot of research currently going on in the lophotrochozoan group, and a lot of moving things around to see who is more related to each other. And so this is a little bit more of an updated version than anything you would find in a textbook. So the Lophotrochozoans include annelids, mollusks, the nemerteans, brachiopods, pharonidas, and the entoproctas. So we're going to start out talking a little bit more about what it means that something is a Lophotrochozoan. So first, what does a Lophotrochozoan mean? What is that term? Zoa means animal. A lophophore is a tentacled feeding structure, and a trochophore is a ciliated larval form. And so Lophotrochozoans are animals that either have a lophophore or a trophophore at some point in their development. So within the Lophotrochozoa, there are 3 phyla in the Bilateria that are called lophophorates. And they're called lophophorates because they have lophophores in their adult stage. There are the Ectoprocta, which are moss animals that live in groups in aquatic environments. There are the Pharonidas, which are tube-dwelling worms, and the Brachiopoda, which are also called lamb shells and have 2 shells. So here we have a little bit simpler version of this tree with the Lophotrochozoans. And within that, we are going to go over the flatworms, the annelids, and the mollusks. The phylum Platyhelminthes is also referred to as the flatworms. Flatworms are represented by some of the simplest bilateral animals in the animal kingdom. Flatworms can be either free-living or parasitic. So on the bottom left-hand side of your screen, you have a diagram of a planarian, which is a free-living flatworm. On that planarian, you can see that they have a cluster of nervous tissue towards the front of their head, and it's the first time that we see something that represents or resembles an organ in an animal. From there, you have 2 nerve cords that move down either side of the planarian's body, and on the underside, you have a mouth structure. You also have a digestive tract, which is its gastrovascular cavity. Planarians are interesting because they have eye spots, which are very early eyes. And something that sometimes students will ask is, why have an eye that doesn't do anything other than detect light? And so in a planarian, the purpose of those eye spots is that they function in a way that allows them to detect whether they're in the sunlight or in the darkness. So they would be hidden under a rock or something else where they're safe. All eyes essentially function the same way and detect light to be able to send messages to the organism about the environment. So your eyes are a little bit more advanced in that they can detect colors and other things, but even things like plants have cells that detect the amount of light and therefore allow the plant to do photosynthesis. So eyes are a very important development in the evolution of animals, and even really simple eyes have a potentially important implication for that animal's survival. Some flatworms are parasitic. This would be something like flukes or tapeworms that parasitize a lot of vertebrates, including humans. And so in some of these earlier evolved animals, we actually see a reduction in some of these characteristics. So something like a tapeworm that lives inside of something doesn't have any need for eye spots. Instead, they need to have structures that allow them to hook up and suck out the fluids from their host. And so what we see in things like tapeworms is that they actually have structures that are developed to help them survive in that environment instead of free living like those seen in something like a planaria. The next phylum is the phylum Mollusca. Mollusks are soft-bodied animals, and most of them are protected by a hard shell. There are three major classes of mollusks. There are gastropods. Gastro means stomach, so gastropod literally means stomach on a foot. There are bivalves, which are protected by two valves or two shells. And there are cephalopods. Cephalo means head, so cephalopods are literally heads on a foot. Gastropods have a single spiral shell, or in some cases, like in slugs, have lost their shell altogether. Gastropods and bivalves both have simple eyes. So if you look at the picture under the bivalve, which is a clam, you can see the little eye spots, and those eye spots allow the clam to open and close its two shells depending on the amount and the size of food that are in its area. And so those eye spots are very simple eyes, but again, they allow that animal to react to its environment. Cephalopods have very advanced eyes. They have a retina and a lens, just like human eyes do, but they were a separate evolutionary event. So this would be an example of convergent evolution. They have where both humans and cephalopods have evolved a retina and a lens, but there are other structural differences of their eye that make them a little bit different than humans. The next phylum is the phylum Annelida. So annelids are segmented worms, and they are coelomates. You probably remember from your lab that annelids actually have a lot of very complex structures within their bodies. So they do actually have a brain, and then they have a nerve cord that runs the length of their bodies on the dorsal part of their body. They also have many different hearts that beat, as well as blood vessels that run the length of their body. They also have excretory organs that release waste products throughout their body. So we've now gone over the Lophotrochozoa, which included the flatworms, the annelids, and the mollusks. There were other groups that we didn't talk about, but those are the three that we talked about from the Lophotrochozoa. Now we're going to talk about the Ecdysozoa. The Ecdysozoa are the last group that are protostomes before we start talking about deuterostomes next time. Ecdysozoans molt their exoskeleton and have a 3 or 4 layered cuticle. On this phylogenetic tree, it's a little bit simplified where it only shows arthropods and roundworms. But in reality, ecdysozoans include arthropods, onchophora, tardigrades, which are those cute little water bears that you may have seen in the news recently. There's the Chinorhyncha, the Priapulidae, the Loricifera, the Nematoda, and the Nematophora. So there's actually quite a bit more diversity in the Ecdysozoa than what is depicted here. So within the Ecdysozoa, there are many, many different groups, but for this class, we're only going to focus on the arthropods and the nematodes. So before I told you that 95% of all animals are protostomes, but now you get to add in that 87% of all metazoa, which are all the true animals, are arthropods. So the majority of the animals on Earth, the majority of the species, fall into the group of arthropods. So first we're going to talk about nematodes, which are also called roundworms. Nematodes, the phylum Nematoda includes some of the most diverse and widespread of all animals. Nematodes can be anything from free living and just in the environment, and they can also be parasitic. So one type of parasitic nematode is Trichinella, which lives in pork and can affect humans if you don't cook your meat correctly. Nematodes can also occur in both aquatic and moist terrestrial habitats, and they have an important evolutionary adaptation, which is a digestive tube with 2 openings. So this is the first time that we see an organism with both a mouth and an anus. They also have a complete digestive tract and can process food and absorb nutrients efficiently. The next group are the arthropods. And like I said, arthropods have more species in that group, in that phylum, than any other phylum in the animal kingdom. So all of the organisms in Arthropoda have jointed appendages. Arthro means jointed and pod means legs. So arthropods have jointed legs. All arthropods have an exoskeleton, and they also are segmented. So their different segments have specialized jobs, and that has been imperative in their ability to speciate as much as they have. Within arthropods, there are 4 main groups. The first are the arachnids, which are things like spiders, scorpions, ticks, and mites. Arachnids have 2 body parts. They have a head and an abdomen, and they also have 8 walking legs. They do not have any antennae. The second type of arthropods are the crustaceans. Crustaceans live in aquatic environments, so they can be either marine or freshwater, and these include things like crabs and lobsters and shrimps and barnacles, and they have many walking legs, so they can actually have 10 or 12 or more. They have feeding legs, they have antennae, and they also usually have a swimming appendages. The next type of arthropods are the Myriapoda. Myriapoda include millipedes and centipedes. All Myriapoda have many body segments with legs on each body segment. Millipedes have 2 pairs of legs per body segment, and centipedes have 1 pair of legs per body segment. They also all have antennae, and they are all terrestrial. The fourth group of arthropods are the insects. Most of these have a 3-part body, all of them have 6 legs, and most of them have wings. Many of the insects undergo metamorphosis in their development. That metamorphosis can either be holometabolous or hemimetabolous. Insects that go through a hemimetabolous metamorphosis, once they have hatched from an egg, their development only changes in their size and reproductive organs. The appearance and the overall shape of the individual does not change. Holometabolous insects go through a metamorphosis where their larval stage is very different from their adult stage. And they have an intermediary stage where they're a pupa between that larval and adult stage.